Fabio, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So you'll be presenting this year at QuantMinds International, and you will be talking about completing the generalized forward market model introduced by yourself and Andrei Lyashenko in 2019. What does this breakthrough mean for quants?
Well, thank you, Lily, for this great question. It would be our pleasure to present again this year at QuantMinds International. So last year, Andrei and I introduced this general framework for the modeling of inner years term rates. And this is important because these rates are due to replace IBORs globally in derivatives contracts and cash instruments. And so we showed how to accommodate existing pricing frameworks, but also, for example, how to extend the classic LIBOR market model to allow for the joint simulation of forward-looking and backward-looking term rates at the same time. And this is important because effectively now we have two different types of rates that we need to simulate both in our pricing frameworks. So this extension of a market model is called by us forward market model, or FMM in short. And it is really an extension. It has all the advantages of the LIBOR market model and plus additional features. But at the same time, it also suffers from the same limitations of the LIBOR market model. And one limitation is the fact that the LIBOR market model can only be defined on a given grid of times. Namely, whenever you simulate rates, you can only simulate the rates that are defined by the initial time grid. So you cannot really price and value directly instruments that are based on general rates or general portfolios, for example. So this could be a problem. So that's why people typically, what they do, they complete the LIBOR market model by thinking about ways of simulating off-grid term rates. And this is exactly what we're going to present this year. So we're going to present a way of completing our FMM, and so that we are able to generate off-grid rates as well. And not only that, we're also able to generate a bank account. This is really important because when it comes to the creation of general inner years term rates, what you want to do, you want to know the current value bank account, but also past values, because again, general backward-looking rates can be defined in terms of ratios of bank accounts. And this will be achieved by embedding our forward market model into a Markovian HJM. And so which is great because effectively we're able to extend our model to something, even more general. And the great news is that, the model we're proposing is effectively a hybrid between an HJM and a LIBOR market model. And this new hybrid model is able to retain advantages of the LMM, so typically the attractability of LMM, but also advantages of the HJM, which is typically the high resolution that the model allows, so the pricing of general rates. So we're very excited to present this year. So please come and attend my talk if you have a chance.
Absolutely, but of course, IBOR is the key word here. What's going to happen when it's discontinued? It's coming up very soon.
Well, that's a very important question, a very broad one, and so many things are going to happen, and in fact, they're already happening. They started to happen a few years ago, and anyway, so I can say that all these things that are happening or will happen can be divided into three main categories. And the first one is the definition of fallbacks. Fallbacks are needed to define contracts in the absence of their reference rates. So you know that every single financial contract, at least the interest rate ones, are based on a key reference rate. Right? So for example, you have a swap that pays LIBOR. And the question you need to address is what's going to happen to your contract if LIBOR disappears? Which kind of rate are you going to receive? So the second problem is the creation of new rate benchmarks, which is and also associated, derivatives market, because you want to replace the existing IBOR-based derivative market with a new one. So if the whole purpose is really to migrate away from LIBOR, you need to make sure that there is an existing market that allows you to do that. And the third thread, if you want, is the creation not only of rate benchmarks, which happen already in most say jurisdictions in the world, but also the creation of risky rate indices, which are similar in nature to LIBORs. And because you may also want to have an index that has some kind of risk premium, or say a component for credit or liquidity risk, which is not currently contained in most of the new benchmarks. So basically what we need to have a recipe to make sure that existing contracts have a meaning, also when the the underlying reference rate disappears. You also need to make sure there is a market for the new rate benchmarks, because we really want to migrate away from the old one. And this is also only possible if there is a new market that allows you to do that. But you may also want to define new indices which are similar in spirit to the old IBORs, because you may want to have an index that is reactive to financial crisis, for example, because it contains some kind of systemic risk component in itself. So these are the main categories that I see of things that actually are happening in the market, and of course we could discuss for hours and hours for every single one. But it's important to say that a lot of things are happening, and this is really a major change is happening in the market, and there's several different areas that need to be considered and addressed to make sure that LIBOR can be phased out successfully.
Of course, earlier this year we've done a webinar on this very topic, and we've actually asked quants about how they feel about their preparedness, and some of them did say that they don't really know where to start. So, what can quants do to prepare for this?
That's a very deep question. So I think quants already started, right? So maybe not everyone, but I think quants started already thinking into these matters very deeply. And I think also quants can help the industry in several different ways. So I think they can help assisting with the definition of new benchmarks, new fallbacks. So anytime there is a need for a new methodology, of course, quants can definitely help, and they've been helping. So as I said, so we need to propose methodologies for term rates, for example, and so the key rates. So the new benchmarks tend to be overnight rates globally. So one issue that you need to address is how to define term rates out of an overnight rate, and so there are several ways to do that, and quants can definitely help with the definition and of those term rates, or so they can help also with the definition of new risky rate indices, the indices I mentioned before. So not just risk-free, but the indices that contain also credit component, for example. And of course, I mean, quants that are working on price risk models should really keep an eye on how the market is evolving, because they also need to upgrade their modeling frameworks, and not only to allow for the use and the simulation of new backward-looking term rates, but also because the whole market is changing. So we need to build essentially new risk-free rate curves. We need to build new volatility cube associated to the risk-free rates. And as I said, we need to upgrade the modeling frameworks to accommodate the new rate benchmarks. So basically what we need to do, we need to redefine calibration instruments, simulate new state variables in production codes, price in new payoffs. And this is done at the level of price individual deals, but also for portfolio analytics, because XVA and general risk calculations are impacted as well. And as I said, a lot of quants already started working to this, and but a lot of information and more work can be done as soon as the market will provide more clarity on the market data that can be used, because liquidity is not there yet in the swap market, but also in the option market. And so as soon as that liquidity is there, we can be more successful implementing some of the changes that are required in our existing pricing frameworks. But what we can definitely do now, and we are already doing now, as quant community collectively, is to discuss ideas and propose solutions, but also start implementing some of the corrections and the new features in our modeling frameworks, which are needed to accommodate the new rate benchmarks, especially the in arrears term rates. That's a quick summary of the things that are already happening and that will be happening in the quant world and community, in the near future.
What's the biggest hurdle left?
Well, there are many. There are many, and we are still struggling addressing some of these issues. And I think there are hurdles at, say, macro levels, so that are faced by the whole industry as a whole, but also hurdles and issues are being addressed by institutions individually. And because every single institution has their own their own problems. Some have been more reactive, some have been slowed down by the COVID crisis, for example, and which poses also questions of whether all institutions will be ready before end of next year, which is roughly the deadline for LIBOR to be discontinued and so on. So, for example, if we focus on individual institutions, there are many things that need to be taken care of. And for example, the very first thing you need to do is to start making inventory of all the possible contracts referencing LIBOR or IBORs that your institution may have, right? And we're not talking just about derivatives. We are talking about bonds, and loans and mortgages. I mean, you name it, right? And the difficulty there is also to identify the corresponding fallback language, because every single contract may have a different fallback language. So they may prescribe some action, some solution in case LIBOR is discontinued, in case the underlying reference rate is no longer published. So this is something that we need to also comply with and to be totally aware of. But this is just one example, right? And of course, I mean, every single institution has been thinking about how to restructure the whole organization to comply with this transition. And so typically problems that we need to define, again, at individual, say, institutional level, but also at global, say, market level, is what to do with existing contracts. So we have a contract like a swap, referencing LIBOR. LIBOR disappears. What are we going to do about that? So essentially, we have a bunch of solutions. And so one possibility would be to adhere to the new ISDA fallback language. This is not really mandatory. So some people may decide that for some reason they don't want to adhere. And or you can say, okay, should we unwind the existing positions? Should we instead repaper them? Or can we do something else? I mean, so there are all questions that we are still addressing the market, and different kind of parties are still discussing. And so then there are other things that, okay, we need to address, and there are still, a bigger hurdle this day. For example, liquidity in the market, I mentioned before. So when we need to build, if you need to build like a new risk-free rate curve based on the new rate benchmarks, like SOFR in the US, you need to have a liquid swap market that supports the creation of the curve. And that market, that liquidity is not there yet, right? So until we reach a liquid market, we may not be able to build like, a very robust yield curve. And we may not be able even to build like a forward-looking term rate. And this is actually a discussion happening in the market these days, because a robust way of building this rate will be actually to extract information from the swap market, aside from futures. But until the liquidity is not reached in the swap market, you can't really extract that information in a robust manner. So then you have a question about the creation of risky rates. Also, Bloomberg, we have an internal initiative to build some risky index, which is a similar spirit to LIBOR. I know there are other financial institutions, independent institutions that are also already coming up with their own proposal. I think there is a need in the market, not only for risk-free term rates, but also for risky indices, because people may want to get a premium in case of a financial crisis, and this is something that risk-free rate typically cannot provide. And I can also mention, as another hurdle that the market is facing, the transition away from old contracts referencing LIBOR. So there are some contracts that cannot be naturally redefined if you replace LIBOR with a backward-looking term rate. Think, for example, of a forward agreement, which requires a payment at the time the rate is set, or a range accrual, which requires the definition of a rate now and not a rate that will be only computed at the end of the corresponding time interval. So there are still some hurdles that need to be addressed. Could be liquidity of the underlying derivatives market. It could be definition of fallbacks. Could be definition of contracts based on new rate benchmarks, and could be definition of new risk indices and so on. But it's also important to say that, again, as a summary, there are hurdles that every single institution is individually facing in terms of governance, practices, internal processes, upgrading their own systems, but also globally by the financial industry in terms of, as I said, the creation of new indices, definition of contracts, and providing liquidity to the new derivatives market, because otherwise, we can't really think of the transition is smoothly from the current LIBOR-based market to a new, key rate market. So these are the main issues that we are globally facing. But I think, given that the clock is ticking and there is not much time remaining, I'm sure that people will accelerate things and will get together to move things forward and address some of the issues before LIBOR is effectively phased out and before end of next year.
Well, Fabio, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been my pleasure, and I will see you at the event.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking these very relevant questions. And if anybody's listened to this talk before my talk at the conference, please come and participate to our discussion, because we're going to have a chance for questions, and both Andrei and I will be presenting, so there will be plenty of opportunities for everybody to discuss about modeling as well.